Good afternoon to those of you who are in London with us, and good morning to those of you who are in the United States or somewhere else in the world, Latin America. We often have people from all over, which has really been one of the silver linings of the last 4 months, which have obviously been really tremendously difficult months for so many people. And in the middle of the pandemic, which has obviously continued to be very dramatic for the part of the world that I've been concerned with. As I'm Leslie Benjamori, I direct the US and Americas program, and as we know, the Americas have really, that entire part of the world has really become ground zero right now for the coronavirus, for the infection, and very sadly and devastatingly for the number of people who are dying. And not long into that, of course, we had the brutal and violent killing of George Floyd and a wave of social unrest and protest that has continued across the United States. Some pretty shocking response to it from President Trump. And also, of course, protests across the UK and many other parts of the world. I will be very clear that this is not my area of expertise. It's something I have great interest in and great concern for. It's very clear that this is becoming a very significant question and issue in individual citizens' minds in the United States. And so it's arguably one of the top, we're told, one of the top 2 or 3 most important issues for Americans as they approach November. And so we felt that it was really important in that context at Chatham House, and certainly on the US and Americas program, given that this is a long-standing set of questions, social, political, and economic issues in the US, but that it's particularly pertinent in the context of one of the most important presidential election of the lifetime of anybody on this call. So it's incredibly relevant for so many reasons, not least in the present moment. It was very easy for me to know who to go to give us a really solid, historical, current, political, contextual understanding of these issues in the United States and in the United Kingdom. And we have 3 really tremendous people to speak about the politics of contention, repression, protest, and the problem of democracy in the United States and the United Kingdom. First, we have Professor Christian Davenport, who joins us from the University of Michigan. He has a very long scholarly career. He's written on human rights, genocide, political violence, repression, racism. One of his books, most relevant perhaps to today's talk, was State Repression and the Domestic Democratic Peace. But he's also continued to write on social movements. And if you haven't read his work, I strongly encourage you to do so. Next, we have Professor Erica Chenoweth, who is from the Harvard Kennedy School. She is the Bertold Beitz Professor in Human Rights and International Affairs. Has also written a lot, many books, most recently in 2020, Civil Resistance, What Everyone Needs to Know. And she's really leading one of the most important projects right now to document the current social unrest and protests across small and large town, city, states across the United States. So has really deep empirical knowledge of the current context. Erica is also the last person that I had dinner with outside of London the weekend before we shut down. So I have fond memories, although it does seem like a very different world. And then Trevor Phillips, who of course is very well known to all of you in the United Kingdom as broadcaster, as journalist, as politician. He is currently a partner at Weber Phillips, but of course he's the person that I immediately turned to for this as somebody with a long and distinguished and highly relevant career in the United Kingdom as a chair of the Commission for Racial Equality, 2003 to 2006, and then when that became the chair. When that became the Commission for Equality and Human Rights, he became the chairman of that through until 2012. So nobody really better placed to give us a serious grounding of issues of race and equality and human rights in the UK, but also with a really very strong connection to the United States and to the Western Hemisphere. Trevor reminded me that while he was born in the UK, he went to school in the Caribbean, depending on where you're from, and has 9 siblings and parents who moved back to the United States in the 1960s. So we join him as transatlantic globetrotters, people who are really deeply rooted on both sides of the Atlantic. So over to you, Christian, to begin, and then to Erica and Trevor. We're each going to take, or the 3 speakers are going to take about 10 minutes, because I really think, given the level of their expertise, it would be good to really get some issues on the table, and then we'll open it up to questions. And we are on the record today, on the record and recording. So Christian, over to you.
Leslie, thank you very much for the invitation, opportunity to speak about these issues. I'll start with some general kind of framing comments that I think will be useful for kind of giving my particular perspective, but also trying to acknowledge in many ways that the topic is not that well discussed, especially within political science and public policy. There's a bit in sociology, there's a bit in history, there's a bit in social work, but political scientists are generally pro-state, and thus not necessarily focused on things that challenge them or provoke them. And at the same time, they're very hopeful and wish to do their best to kind of eliminate certain things that I think are a little bit more contentious than they wish to deal with. But I actually want to start with some more foundational stuff, right? So state coercion and force is intricately connected with our definition of the state, our conception of the state. Except political scientists usually make a jump from that to kind of like, well, okay, so therefore, democracy must be on the lower end of this use of coercion and force, and autocracy is at the higher end. That's not found empirically. It sounds good, and we miss a bunch of dynamics. So we think of free and fair multi-party elections, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and a bunch of other kind of like rights and personal integrity violations as being part of this. But I'll suggest think of these as levels. And so as we hit a particular level of freedom of expression, then we would start to think that we're existing in a democracy. What we're missing is, however, the rates that generate these particular levels, the quotidian activities that kind of accumulate over time and over space. And so the arrests, the curfews, the targeted assassinations, the surveillance, all these events lead us to some particular level. But once the particular manifestations, once the rates have diminished, we tend to think that things are okay. We're missing some of the after effects of repression, for example. The acceptance of some individuals with certain forms of inequality, the moving away from certain types of ideas that might be challenging to capital or to centralized coercive power. And so we start to stop thinking about that. But for the same kind of rate level dynamic, we also need to think about contention. We have individuals that are stepping forward on a daily or weekly basis right now, and these are rates of contention, and then they kind of concatenate to give us some level of unconventional political participation, right? So we could talk about the labels a little bit. But what is most important is that these relationships, what's repression doing, what's dissent doing, and how is that related to democracy, is extremely complex, as there's a co-evolutionary dynamic taking place between the 3 of them, which is normally neglected by the kind of maximalists who just kind of like, well, when we have a democracy, then repression will be low and dissent will be non-existent because everyone's happy, right? I mean, but no, contention, dissent, is the mechanism that people go to that are systematically unable to access other forms of the political system. And this is both in autocracies and democracies. And so I wish to complicate this kind of relatively simple and straightforward, I think, characterization of what people think of when they kind of relate the 3 to one another. Related, we also have these different levels of analysis, right? So Portland for me is interesting because you have kind of local, state, and federal police. So you have local, state, and federal challenges that are taking place. Now, the President of the United States has determined that the federal authorities needed to go into Portland because the local authorities weren't able to handle their business. And that is allowing peaceful protesters to go about their business, to dissent and identify that something is problematic. So if you can't get the local folks to do it, then maybe, and the state people are not necessarily as beholden to as you would like, then you send in the feds. Okay, so this becomes an interesting dynamic because now we need to think of different levels of analysis. Now, this is very different from the South, right? So the local and state authorities were the local authorities were more or less the ones that were engaging in repressive activity against the nonviolent activists and being persecuted at that particular level. Then the movement went up to the federal level to try to get intervention. So these levels exist concurrently all the time, but also these are dynamics that are missing. So I'll be Mr. Complication today, right? So I also wish to complicate the fact that why are we just talking about democracy when we should be talking about capitalism? I mean, so we have the political system, which we're used to talking about as political scientists, and we have the demarcation of democratic from authoritarian systems, but there's an economic order that generally exists with or underlying these particular institutions, which we have to address as they're the ones, these issues are the ones that are, quite frankly, the things that the political system is forced to contend with. So given the nature at which capitalism generates certain types of inequalities, the political system then needs to intervene in some way, shape, or form to address the fact that we're going to have like a large number of homeless people or a lot of people that are unemployed or underemployed or treated poorly by the police who are set out to basically subjugate and contain this population of unequal, poorly treated individuals. So like getting to the core of why are the police engaging with the Black community in the United States in the way that they are and how that relates more to the economic system than the political system, then puts us at a disadvantage in talking about the problem when we're trying to talk about, well, we just need to get the right leaders in office. Okay, yes, we need to channel the mobilization into something, Obama and Cory Booker's rather, I think, offensive phrase. It's like, kind of like, let the adults talk now. You all got this issue on the table. Let the adults go behind doors and draft the right legislation that'll correct these problems. And I'm like, are you kidding me? This is not worked historically. And no one's really talking about what's at issue with regards to why the police are targeting the Black people in the way that they do. And why are the Black people potentially in awkward situations? So there's this, we could think of this 2x2 with regards to political institutions this way and then economic institutions this way, and exactly trying to identify where we are and where people want to be. But I think that's something that's also useful. And from my perspective, I think of Michael Walzer's spheres of justice. The minute the economic system is corrupting the political system and we no longer have separate spheres of justice, we no longer have separate spheres of influence, then that's a problem. And we need to kind of like separate the two. And you have, so I'm not sure exactly what you all in the UK are aware of with regards to the proliferation of like institutions that exist behind the Black Lives Matter movement. It's not a movement. There's a whole bunch of organizations. There's the Black Youth, it's BYP 100. They all have acronyms too. It's like, and if you start going through exactly what their manifestos are, what they're calling for, they're identifying some problems with the security apparatus or violence workers, as Nicole Siegel would say. There's some problems with political institutions. There's some problems with economic institutions. And unfortunately, I don't think they all map up together, but I think there's an interesting array of opinions that are identifying some of the things that I'm talking about, some local, some state, some political, some economic. And I think it's useful to think about those particular issues as it relates to kind of a broader kind of conception of what's going on. And since it's probably going to come up, I also kind of want to talk about one last thing. So Bing Powell had this book called Elections as Instruments of Democracy that I found very interesting years ago. I don't remember what was written, but his whole comment was, he's like, so what are people thinking about when they go to kind of like pull that lever and vote? And unfortunately, one of the things they're not thinking about is normally contentious politics. And so we can't be that hopeful that people are going to internalize the understanding of what's taking place now, and that as they're voting, that's the thing that they're going to be thinking about. And in fact, I unfortunately like to think about this other book called Compassion Fatigue, which is people are motivated and they are understanding of a particular problem. But if that problem is not being met with a series of resolutions and answers that they think is reasonable or clear or simple, they move on. They move on to another topic. And what we're dealing with in the United States as it relates to racial violence and police powers and so forth, discretionary powers and capabilities, and the rightful role of protest within the society. These are not simple issues. They're not going to be resolved in any straightforward manner. And so this does not, for me, add up to a clear resolution of what people are going to do electorally. It's not a clear resolution of what people are going to advocate with regards to what should be done within the society. And so I didn't want to make it sound like that sounds more negative than I intended it. But let me stop on the negative sounding comment. But I'm not as bad in terms of my hopefulness as that the last statement sounded.
Christian, thank you. That's really helpful. I mean, you've clearly you've put a lot on the table, and I think from the point of view of perhaps, and it might be unfair because there's clearly a lot of depth of understanding across the UK in some pockets, but if you just kind of read the headline stories, there's certainly not a strong understanding of the disparate nature and the complexity of the Black Lives Matter movement. And you've sort of, put your finger on that. I know Erica's likely to say a lot more about that. I think that's incredibly helpful. There's also a lot of focus here on police violence as being kind of the demand of a lot of the current wave of protests. And you've certainly intimated that I think people understand, right, that the range of issues is much more complex, that it's linked to deep structural issues at the founding of the United States, slavery, and that there's a structural racism. I don't think there's a lot of understanding about kind of to what extent the current wave of social unrest is trying to target broader issues. But I'm sure people are going to come back and ask you that, but I appreciate that you've put capitalism, democracy, the fact that contentious politics, even when they're not visible, the structural, the repression element is still there in democracies, even when we're not watching it because it's on the streets of Portland every day. So thank you and the levels, local, state, federal, again, a story that's sort of only a little bit understood over here, and it is clearly very complex. Erica, I know you have been looking incredibly carefully at this in the past few months, obviously in the context of your long-standing scholarship on civil disobedience, on civil resistance, on social movements. So I look forward to hearing your comments.
Great, thank you so much, Leslie, for the convening, and to my colleagues who are on the panel as well. I guess I want to pick up on what you two just left off with regard to what is the nature of the problem that's being expressed right now, and what the movement is actually trying to create, or the movement of movements is trying to address. And I just want to start with what I think is a helpful heuristic called the 4 I's of oppression, which often helps me to understand why there's misunderstanding about the nature of racism and the effects of racism on society. So the 4 I's are that racism has basically 4 components: an ideological component, an interpersonal component, an institutional component, and an internalized component. And, I think when people are confronted with a critique that what they have said or done is racist, often white people in particular react defensively and say, but I'm not racist, because they don't see themselves as having a racist ideology. That is to say, they believe that all people are equal. And what they're referring to or catching in that sense is the ideological racism. So they think of one of the 4 I's, right? And they say, I'm not ideologically racist because of my belief system that all people are equal or should be equal. There are, of course, people who do have ideological racism, who believe that that non-white people are subordinate and inferior and inhuman in some respects. And so when people talk about racism, white people often conjure that image and think that that's not them. But there are 3 other components of racism that we participate in. The second is interpersonal, which is how a person might interact with or treat a person of a different race. But perhaps the most pernicious and problematic is the institutionalized racism, which is to say that systems of power, whether it's capitalism or whether it's the nature of the state, et cetera, is designed to essentially produce inequalities between races. And so the way that that power has been institutionalized in the United States is essentially to to protect the interests of what used to be the majority white kind of colonial power with capital, and to make sure that when and if Black people were emancipated, that they would not be able to exercise as much power as white people. And that's kind of in lots of different laws, but it also isn't necessarily self-conscious, right? So the fact that different programs create structural inequalities and poverty between white and Black people is not always the intent of the policy, but it's the effect of the policy. And so that's institutionalized racism. It's the fact that policies that we pass have these unequal effects, and we don't interrogate it, and we don't ask where it comes from and why it's happening. And then there's the fourth I, which is internalized racism. This is kind of subconscious bias. It's things that people carry regardless of how they've been racialized or coded, about the sort of the fact that, since I was 5 years old, when I went out into the world, my teachers were all white, my doctors were all white, the people who were in positions of power and authority that I saw on the television were mostly white. And so what that does is internalize a narrative of racial difference and power differentials according to racial difference. And so I think that the four I's can be helpful in understanding why the nature of the claims that the Movement for Black Lives is making right now are so sweeping, why they ask us to interrogate at a personal level the nature of the way that racism plays out and the way that we interact with the world, all the way to the call to defund the police, abolish the police, all the way to reparations, because they're trying to address comprehensively all of the different dimensions of racism and its effects in our society. So anyway, with that said, Jeremy Pressman, my colleague at the University of Connecticut, and I have been trying to collect data on every protest that's happened in the United States since Trump's inauguration. And so we have daily event data on protest events all across the United States, as well as the police response, whether protesters were arrested or hurt, whether police were hurt, and whether property was damaged. Now we're adding whether tear gas or other respiratory kind of chemical agents have been used, because we are in the midst of a respiratory pandemic. And so that has implications as well for lots of the nature of repression and how it's interacting with our environment right now. So essentially, this is a public interest project. You can look at it at crowdcounting.org. The goal of it is to provide timely and reliable documentation of protest, counter-protest, and police response during the Trump administration. And here's what I want to say about the current movement. So Jeremy and I know that almost 29 million people in the United States have protested since January 21st of 2017 across over 45,000 events. Of these, well over 10% of those events have taken place in the last week of May and the first 2 weeks of June of this year. So in other words, over 10% of the contentious politics events that we observed over the past 3.5 years alone took place in the immediate aftermath of the George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery uprisings of a 3-week time period. Among those, we have counted millions of people who participated in those 3 weeks of an uprising, which is ongoing, but we just don't have the data because it's a tsunami of events that we're trying to code. But basically, among those, we've already counted millions of people. Polling that's been done by various different groups suggests that anywhere between 10 and 24 million Americans claim that they participated in a racial justice protest during those 3 weeks. So if all of this is true, which I think it is because it's been cross-validated across a number of different sources at this point, what we are looking at is the largest, broadest, and most sustained mobilization in US history in terms of the scope of events. That is well over 5,000 events on one day, even June 6th to 7th, as well as the number of events concentrated in time across a geographic scope. So there are only about 3,100 counties in the United States. And probably over 85% of those saw at least one racial justice protest, maybe a higher proportion. So this is by far the most broad kind of collective action episode we've ever seen in the United States. This is, for context, many of you might have recalled the Women's March of 2017. In the United States, there were between 4 and 6 million people who participated in what was at that point the largest single-day demonstration in US history, making up about 1.8% of the population. So what we've seen with the anti-racism uprisings of the last couple of months may be anywhere from 3 to 10 times as large as the Women's March of 2017. I want to mention that this very much didn't happen spontaneously and was largely possible, I would say, because of the organizational infrastructure that has been emerging over the past 10 years, which itself was built on organizational knowledge and infrastructure that had been built throughout the civil rights movement and before that. But in particular, when Trayvon Martin was lynched in Florida in 2012 by George Zimmerman, and then a year later, George Zimmerman was acquitted from his trial, at which he was charged with crimes related to the killing. That is when we saw the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2013. It was with George Zimmerman's acquittal because the laws of Florida and of this country more generally are that people can carry weapons, and if they feel threatened, they can kill a person with legal impunity. And so that in this instance makes us understand how those 4 eyes of racial oppression result in the completely extrajudicial killings and lynchings of Black people in this country, and that white people often are not charged or are not jailed for these crimes. And so that helps us understand the institutionalized nature of racism and our laws and our legal system and the way that that interacts with the interpersonal and internalized racism. So Black Lives Matter then was escalated in a major way in 2014 when Mike Brown was killed by a police officer in Ferguson, Missouri. That led to a larger national uprising, including a freedom ride. And then that was accelerated with the killings of many other unarmed Black men like Eric Garner, Freddie Gray, and Black women as well. So ultimately, there was a period of demobilization and regrouping that took place within the Black Lives Matter movement. There was a lot of local organizing. Communities had been interacting with their police departments significantly to try to come up with better community policing models. You know, that is sort of laying the groundwork for what has now been this really sustained period of multi-racial, multi-generational mobilization that's taken place in the US since. So I'll stop there because I've already gone on too long, but I can develop any of the trend data later on.
Erica, thank you. That was tremendously helpful, both in the framing and also in the data and the sort of recent history and overview. Trevor, is it, you know, should we all be on the same panel? You know, we in the UK, we sort of say, you know, it's all Black Lives Matter and it's all, you know, but are these things at all the same? You do need to unmute, by the way, Trevor, before you, we've just lost, oh, there we are. You need to unmute. But we are relying on you because you really do have worked in the weeds in a serious way in the UK, but you obviously think and know and engage and write about the US also. So enlighten us. Are you on the wrong panel? Or are you on the right panel?
I'm absolutely not on the right panel because this panel is far too distinguished for me. I am basically a kind of common number cruncher. I should explain very briefly. I spend most of my life now running a couple of businesses, one of which is a data analytics firm that worries about demography, and some of that bears on this question. I also write regularly for the Times. I'm a journalist, so and I have been for 40 years. Every time I say that, I think, isn't it time to lie down and retire? But I've spent quite a lot of my life covering what people sometimes call race riots. So that's obviously a nonsense description. And as you kindly pointed out, most of my family, which is very large, we're a big tribe, now lives in the United States. And it was striking listening to Erica. I have a brother who lives in Florida, and he lives about an hour south of where Ahmaud Arbery was killed. But about 3 years ago, I was visiting him, and I went for a run in the morning. And when I got back, he said, "Oh, where'd you go?" And I told him, and he said, "Oh, how did you get back from there?" And I said, "I went through this route, and I went down that street, and I ran across that lawn." And he said, "Never do that again." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Down here, we have a law called stand your ground. And that means that if you run across somebody's property, they can shoot you. And what you need to understand, Trevor, is that whatever the hell they think you are in London, down here, you're just another black man that they don't know, and they will kill you. So just please, either don't go for a run, or let me give you a safe route." And I think Erica's point about the, to some extent, I guess, a siege mentality that exists amongst African Americans, for this reason and some others, which I want to go into very briefly, I think is an important key to this discussion. We will no doubt talk a bit about structural racism. And I just want to say right from the outset, I think that the terms in which a lot of these debates are conducted aren't so much confusing, but still contested. And it would be great to get a little bit of ground clearing about what people actually mean when they say X or Y. So, for example, I think that a lot of people in the Black Lives Matter movement, certainly here in the UK, talk about structural racism. And what they mean by that is really bad acts by bigoted people. Actually, in my own view, and I think I suspect the view of my co-panelists, that's not what it's about at all. Originally, I think when Stokely Carmichael and Charles Hamilton coined the phrase institutional racism, which is kind of in the same territory, that the point they were trying to make is that you could populate any police force with a band of angels, and they would still end up treating black folk in exactly the same way. That the point here is not to make people nicer. The point here is to try to change the conditions under which people operate, and that will change their behaviors. First, if I can say a few words about my view about the United States and what I think lies behind the events of the last 6 months. Well, of course, it's not particularly clever to say that what we've seen in the last 6 months hasn't just come out of nowhere. I mean, that's not smart. The truth is that there are deeper trends and undercurrents, which I hope that the conversation that can now be engendered will allow us to talk about. And I want to pick out two and ask a question about the United States. The first is the demographics. And there are two aspects of this. One of the things that is absolutely clear is that the world is changing for Black America. If you go to Harlem, you go to central Detroit, you go, I spent some time in a place I've never been before, which is Austin, Texas. The truth of the matter is that the demographics of the places where African Americans live are changing quite dramatically. The city centres, of course, are being repossessed. They are being gentrified. They are being spruced up. They are being bought out. And who's moving in and who's moving out is profound. What we're seeing is dislocation of those communities. That is a fundamental. That's a fundamental trend, which I think has not been paid enough attention to. The second demographic point, which I think is worth paying attention to, and of course, I guess it doesn't pay anybody much to talk about this, but it is a big deal. African Americans are no longer the United States' most important minority. They're not even the largest. Hispanic Americans are at 52 million. By the middle of this century, there'll be about 130 million. And in the real world, that is what matters more than the past. Asian Americans, wealthier, more involved and more penetrating of many of the power structures of, to take Christian's point, capitalism. The truth of the matter is that psychologically and politically, African Americans, though they matter for branding purposes, are in corporations. You can't be unpleasant to African Americans, but do they matter as much as they did 40 years ago? Very, very unlikely. And I can tell you some stories about clients which explain that. The other big area which I'd like to mention is the impact of digitization. We know that automation, artificial intelligence, and so on is sweeping across the industrial landscape. We also know that it is COVID, I beg your pardon, has accelerated change. It will not, this is asymmetric, the change will be asymmetrical as far as the industrial landscape is concerned. And it is very, very clear already that besides the fact that there'll be a gender asymmetry, that there'll also be an ethnic asymmetry, particularly, for example, let's say the area of distribution, warehouses and so on. Big area of automation. If you go to Memphis, second biggest cargo and distribution center in North America, largely occupied by the 50% of the Memphis population that is black, is about to be automated. Those people are going to be automated out of work. They will have to live a different life, find different things to do. So underlying a lot of what we're seeing, I don't want to minimize the impact and the importance of the police question and the criminal justice issue and the levels of incarceration. But underlying all of that is a level of dislocation and unsettlement in Black America, which is absolutely profound and to which actually nobody's really begun to have an answer. Which brings me to a question, which is, I would be very, very keen to hear from American colleagues about Black leadership. Historically, African-American leadership has come from historically Black colleges, the churches, actually wealthy Blacks. There are currently 1 million African-American millionaires. What is really striking to me is that leadership seems to have gone missing. It is not at all clear to me where the African-American leadership stands on some of these deeper trends. It would be very interesting to hear that. On the United Kingdom, I think some of the digitization issues are exactly the same, so I'm not going to repeat myself on that. On the police questions, there's similarities, but of course, because our police by and large are not armed, the threat of lethal force doesn't carry the same cultural impact that it does in the United States. We don't, generally speaking, have to give our children the talk in the sense that telling them how to behave because we fear for their lives. We try and tell them how to behave, but generally speaking, we don't think they're going to get shot. I think demographics is a more interesting issue and a more interesting difference for two reasons. First of all, in the United Kingdom, Black lives, our Black population is relatively small by comparison and relatively small compared to the whole population, but we do have a substantial population of people of color. And the bigger groups are South Asian, particularly and increasingly now African. One of the differences between us and the United States is, of course, different ethnic minorities are performing very differently. So South Asians are likely on average to earn about 12 to 15% above whites, whereas Africans and Somalis and so on, considerably less, and Pakistani Muslims, way less, more than 10 to 15% less than average. So there's a divergence between different ethnic minority groups in this country, which I think creates a different kind of cultural and political issue. The second thing which I want to just put on the table is that there's a very peculiar phenomenon in the United Kingdom, which is not reflected actually, oddly enough, anywhere else in the world, including in Europe. And that is that we have a population of about 1 million people out of our 66 million or so, who are what we call mixed race. And these are people who, most of them actually, the biggest group of them, are people with one white parent and one black parent. So when we, for example, talk about African Caribbeans in this country, it is probably the case that on average, we are likely to be talking about somebody who has both a black parent and a white parent. Now that's very unusual, except in countries where race mixing has been the result of slavery, apartheid, or enforced race mixing of one kind or another, the United States, Brazil, South Africa. This particular population is very, very unusual. We don't know enough about it. We don't know what its preferences are. What it means to be a person who can genuinely and legitimately claim to be part of two quite different traditions. I think all of that is very new for us, and is a very specific feature of the British politics. And why it's important is this: it means that there is a very substantial proportion of the British population that we would call white, which has in its family people that we would call black. Now that exists elsewhere, and it's true in the United States, but certainly nothing like to the same degree. On Black Lives Matter movement, there are a lot of things that are similar here to there. I just want to make one simple, quick point. One of the things that surprises me about the Black Lives Movement at some level is how unradical their demands are. If the issues are of the scale that I think they are, pulling down statues, to me, doesn't seem to be very important, frankly. And one of the things that I'm very struck by is I chair a recruitment company, the executive recruitment company. We deal with a lot of big companies, S&P, FTSE 100 companies. And my corporate clients are incredibly comfortable with Black Lives Matter. They're really comfortable with it. And when I think that my corporate clients are really comfortable with politics, I start to wonder if the politics are right, because actually that's not where we should be. Last point, and I can expand on that if you would like. We are actually going to, the last point I really want to make is this. There's a very particular phenomenon in the United Kingdom. When we survey our people, race relations or attitudes towards other races are probably more tolerant, generous, and liberal than anywhere else in Europe, and certainly more so than the United Kingdom. Yet in terms of movement of people from minorities into positions of power and influence, we're actually going nowhere. And I think it's a very interesting question that tells us something about this point I started out with about structural racism, that in a country where I myself would say it is more congenial to live as a black person than anywhere else, it is still less likely that a person of color is going to receive career advancement, move into a better home, have a better future for their children, which tells us actually that we need to be careful not to bark up the wrong tree, that changing people's attitudes is what's going to change outcomes for minorities. The most significant mobilization of black folks across the developed world has not actually been Black Lives Matter. It hasn't even been Obama's election in 2008. It has been the film Black Panther, which is the highest grossing superhero movie other than the Avengers series in history. And that's black people coming out, organizing block parties, buying out theaters and so on. Now, why is that? Well, I've got one hypothesis. It is because Black Panther says, what we need is a muscular, independent black presence that doesn't compromise, that doesn't mess about with whites, doesn't rely on them, feels confident to say to a white man in Africa, hello, colonizer. And at the end of the movie, turns up in a poor Black American neighborhood and says, we're going to use Wakanda's billions to sort this out. We're not relying on the white folks anymore. I think this is a rather interesting and significant shift in mood, and one that we have not paid enough attention to. I'll shut up now.
There's a lot in there, and a lot in all three of your comments. I want to ask, I guess, back to Erica and Christian in response to Trevor, one or maybe two questions before we open it up. So if you're ready to ask your questions, you'll need to unmute when I come to you. Two things. One is, it is a very interesting question, right? Whether the Black Lives Matter movement remains and is singularly about African Americans and Black citizens in other countries, and or how it contends with the broader question of diversity and other immigrant groups, other diverse categories of non-whites. And I'm curious, what your, I guess, empirical assessment is of that, especially you, Erica, in the US context, because Trevor said a lot of very interesting things on that dimension. And then this very interesting point about corporate Britain, I take you to be saying corporate Britain is very comfortable with the demands of the current movement or protests. And does that mean that, is that an indicator of the fact that really the movement is not very radical, is mainstreamed, is not targeting structural change, is asking for the easy things, hire more people in certain categories? What is your reaction to that? I'm going to come to you first, Christian. Hey, you have to unmute, Christian.
So this brings us back to repression. The reason why we have such a de-radicalized movement currently is because the individuals that they would have drawn upon, the institutions that they would have drawn upon, the ideological claims making material that they would have drawn upon has been purged from the American society. The Black nationalist movement, which is directly in line with kind of the last comment about the Black Panther, which is, we could talk about that, but the thing that's kind of like missing here is just like, okay, so what would people have drawn upon? They would not draw upon C.L.R. James. They wouldn't have drawn upon Du Bois, Black Reconstruction. They wouldn't have drawn upon Alan Locke. They don't know who these people are. And that's because this group of individuals has been systematically eliminated from the discussion of what folks are doing. There's a great rupture that exists with regards to the particular understanding that people have of the problem, the diagnoses of the problem. Those people that had those particular diagnoses that would have advanced the Black Lives Matter movement in a more radical direction, in a more comprehensive direction, have been eliminated. They're not looking to them for answers. In fact, they're not clear where to look for folks. If you actually look at what people are advocating that we should do, that reparations, okay, you had a group called the Republic of New Africa that I wrote about 2 books ago. The Republic of New Africa, after they get devastated, they reconfigure later on to do the National Coalitions of Blacks for Reparations in America. The new group is not drawing upon this particular trajectory of thought. They're drawing upon Randall Robinson and some other folks. So it's like there's strands that they know that they should do something on reparations, but they're not quite sure what. They think that they should do something on Black empowerment, but they're not quite sure what. They're not sure exactly how these things fell apart previously. They're not sure exactly how they should go about resolving them. And thus we end up in this bizarre situation where there's strands of ideas that are not able to be put together in a coherent fashion because many of the people that did put them together in a coherent fashion are not being drawn upon. But we're not talking about, while we're celebrating the sheer largesse of the activities of people on the street, we're not celebrating or not talking about the vacuousness of the current movement with regards to what they're talking about, the limitations of what Occupy had to talk about in terms of the lack of coherency of their program, because that's a very unhappy story. It's a happy story to see people mobilize. It's not a happy story to see what they're mobilizing about and how this might not resolve the particular problems that they're interested in. And just because the police go away doesn't mean that your lives will be better. I mean, I see no discussion of private policing. I see no discussion of private prisons. So, okay, so the state publicly defunds police. That says nothing about what private institutions can do because there's no discussion of the private sector. There's no conversation of what corporations can do and how everybody's going to privatize these things. So I think these are definitely interrelated questions, but again, we're back to repression, dissent, and democracy, political institutions, and how these three relate to one another to understand the current moment.
And just for those of you who noticed the quiet smile between Erica and Christian when Trevor talked about the Black Panther film, Christian wrote a book, Media Bias, Perspective, and State Repression, the Black Panther Party in 2010. So certainly something that that resonates in his base of knowledge. Erica, over to you on this general. Well, there are a couple of questions in there about the de-radicalization, I guess, in particular.
Well, I think I differ a little bit from Christian on this. I think the contemporary movement does draw from previous experience, but there is some desire to depart from what has been seen as some failures of previous movements in two major respects, I think. The first of which is an emphasis on organization and hierarchy within some previous Black-led organizations, particularly during the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Power movement. And the second is sort of a patriarchal system that that predominated in many kind of historical Black-led organizations. And so the contemporary movement, I think, has two key departures from that. The first is that the primary national organizers or co-founders of Black Lives Matter were three queer Black women who wanted to draw upon, I believe, more feminist grounded understandings of Black liberation. And so they are referring to some historical reference points, and they are trying to draw on some knowledge, collective knowledge, but I think their icons are Angela Davis, Ella Baker, Assata Shakur, Audre Lorde, and others, as opposed to some of the other more kind of mainstreamed figureheads of previous eras. And there's also a desire to have shared leadership and kind of horizontal yet highly accountable structure, as opposed to a more highly organized and hierarchical structure, which they saw both as leading to inequalities within the movement, particularly against women, but also to major vulnerabilities when it came to repression. And the ease with which such movements could be infiltrated and destroyed easily. So I think that there are some lessons that are being integrated in terms of the claims making. I think that it's an emergent movement, and like Christian said earlier, it's drawing from so many different streams. The part of the issue here is the fact that there are community Black-led organizations that have been working with their police departments, trying to come up with solutions that work for their locality. And that may not look like abolish the police, but they understand abolish the police in their context as meaning reorder the nature of power in our community and create real accountability and real responsiveness of public servants and et cetera. And abolish the police elsewhere means actually people don't want a carceral system at all. They want to move toward more kind of restorative justice models. They want to move toward more radical experimentation between communities and people that are conferred authority by the community itself to deal with public problems around safety, security, well-being, and the centering of care. So I do think that there are some radical conversations happening. And I think it's not surprising that at the national level, it can feel somewhat surface, especially when people are getting their sense of the claims being made from Twitter or social media, where it's not super deep. So,
okay, I'm going to come to I think John has written a question, and we'll come to John Prideaux and then Peter Hurst and Tangi Morgan. But John, if you unmute.
Sure, thank you. I hope it's not too noisy here. I've got small kids running wild in the next door room. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you for putting this together. All your Chatham House panels have been fantastic during lockdown. They've kept me going, and this one's been excellent for me. Thank you so much. My name's John Prideaux. I'm the US editor at The Economist, so I'm responsible for The Economist's coverage of the United States. I had one question to both Christian and Chenoweth, and then, sorry, Christian and Erica, and to be greedy, a question to Trevor as well. To Christian and Erica, both of you have spent lots of time studying social movements and protest movements. And I'm interested in how you see the trajectory of BLM, which, as Christian says, you know, is made up of lots and lots of smaller groups. And so talking about it as a movement is more of a shorthand than a kind of accurate description. But I'm just wondering, you know, prior to George Floyd's murder, it seemed to me at least that BLM had faded a bit in the conversation in America because a lot of American liberals were so busy talking about Donald Trump that they almost didn't have sort of bandwidth for anything else. And then fortunately, you know, the subject, you know, the sort of good side effect of the awful thing was the subject came, you know, back to prominence after George Floyd's murder. But looking at other protest movements and social movements, is there a way you think that BLM could kind of fizzle and fail to achieve its aims? You know, if you wanted to give advice to, you know, people working within that movement as to how to achieve their aims, you know, based on the studies you've made, what would that advice be? And then to Trevor, just a plea from one journalist to another to spill the beans on some of your clients, because that you can't just drop something like that in and then not you know, not be forthcoming.
I'll let you take that question, and then we'll come right back to Peter Tangi, and we have a very good list here actually. Trevor, do you want to go first? Spill the beans. Unmute first, though, before you spill the beans, so we can hear you spill the beans.
Oh, okay. did you not hear the list that I just given? Oh my God! I'll deal with it later, right? Can I just quickly, before I come back quickly to the point that Christian and Erica were discussing. I thought Christian's point about, you know, what texts, as it were, people were dealing with it's a really very important one. And I'm absolutely not an academic, you know, I'm not in that territory at all. However, obviously, protest movements do draw on traditions, and sometimes those are handed down by stories of one kind or another. And I think one of the things that's very, very striking to me is that at some point there seems to be a dislocation. So, for example, if you talk to people in BLM, they don't know actually who the Black Panthers were, except as a kind of fashion icon. They don't really know who Stokely Carmichael was. I was really stunned to see a reading list in one of our newspapers, the Sunday Times, about a month ago, of classic Black anti-racist texts, which included novels and all sorts, in which neither Du Bois nor Toni Morrison figured. I mean, even as I say it, I cannot imagine any list of classic Black texts in which Toni Morrison does not figure, making any sense to anybody anywhere. So I think Christian's got a very important point about the movement really somehow drawing, I think actually it draws on different traditions, much more to do with the same tradition that has given us Extinction Rebellion than to do with Black history. I mean, we can talk about that more if you like. And that's partly one of the reasons why I think that the, if I can put it this way, the list of demands is so thin, actually. It really doesn't ground any analysis. I mean, they talk a lot about, there's a lot of talk about power structures, but the analysis isn't actually grounded in a view about power structures. On the question that John specifically asked me, no, I'm not going to tell you, but what I will say is this, that actually you can look at the list of Green Park's clients, and I can probably tell you that of the 300-400 that are there, I could count on the fingers of one hand the people, the companies where I think people will be made uncomfortable by Black Lives Matter. I think most of the corporate world thinks it's fine, because what they're really being asked to do is to send a signal. And frankly, that is the easiest thing in the world to do. It really is the easiest thing in the world to do. I mean, one of the things that really struck me about the demonstrations here is that, you know, there were demonstrations here, there, and everywhere. The one place that I didn't see a demonstration was outside any of the companies where, when you walk in, the security guard is black, the woman in reception might be Asian, then when you go up, you're taken up by somebody who's probably white, and you get to the floor where there is nobody who is not white. Now, I didn't see a single demonstration outside any of the dozen companies of that kind that I know. And to be absolutely frank, we're speaking semi-privately, when that starts to happen, that's when I start to take that seriously as a protest movement. The rest of it is street theater.
Just so you know, Trevor, we're not speaking that privately because this is recorded and will be posted. But
okay, I don't mind people knowing. Everybody who knows me knows I think that anyway. So there's no secrets about that.
But no, I think it's actually really healthy to have it on the record. So I appreciate that, Erica and Christian, and then I'm going to come out to probably a group of you because there are some really. I'm sure that there are some very good questions coming from the people on the list. Erica.
Yeah, so I think it's a great question. There's always risks that movements will fizzle out before they begin to initiate the change that they want to see. But this movement, I think, has some real staying power and also has already started to create some meaningful and in some cases costly changes. For one thing, we know from previous scholarship by scholars like Omar Wassow and Legina Gauss and Dan Gillian that Black-led protest in particular elevates concerns that make it onto the agenda. They change the way that people in elected office vote. They change who gets elected to office. They alter public opinion about, in particular, Black-led protests. And this has been true for decades in the United States. We also know that the larger a movement is and the more diverse the coalition that it builds, the more likely it is to create and initiate major changes. And some of the changes that we've already observed in the United States may be kind of symbolic, as Trevor and Christian had mentioned earlier, like the taking down of statues, symbols, and Confederate flags, et cetera. But some of them are costly, like the NFL basically having to come out and say that it was wrong and to have punished players for wanting to kneel during the national anthem. I know that sounds symbolic. It's in this country a major issue because the NFL is basically willing to lose a huge number of viewers and fans over this issue by taking a stand. Same with a lot of the different kind of college football programs and such, and that's a huge moneymaker. In the United States, college football is like the major fundraising device for alumni, and so taking a stand on these things will hurt their profits. And then the last thing I'll say is that we've seen a major shift in public opinion. So over the past few weeks, support for the movement for Black Lives and its primary fundamental claims has skyrocketed and increased to a degree that we've never seen before with any similar protest movement of this kind. And the types of public opinion shifts that we've seen here remind me of what Doug McAdam calls cognitive liberation, or what Christian and some of his earlier work has called cognitive activation, that once people participate and change their minds about something, they don't usually go back on it, and they usually start actually seeing discrimination in more places than they expected to going forward. And so that can create real commitment and have people put their money where their mouth is in meaningful ways.
Christian.
Yeah, this sounds, I rarely disagree with Erica. So this bizarre point. So my thing is, I guess I'm concerned with beware of the channel would be my comment. what happens when contentious politics generally kind of emerges is there's a channeling effect where we're looking for the messiah, we're looking for the right organization, we establish the committee, then that gets pulled into something, and then they start talking, and then folks are wearing kente cloths, so they're doing other types of things, and then some document comes out, and something kind of like there's some discussion further, and then we forget exactly what it is that we cared about before, which is Black people not getting killed by the police, but more broadly, Black people not dying from all these other discriminatory practices that are not exactly kind of coming out, right? So I'm just like, how does the economy function? What's going to happen with corporations? What's going to happen with profit? What's going to happen with labor? What's going to happen with white wealth? Give Black people $350,000 a year. What does that mean for white wealth? Are whites going to stop generating capital for 400 years until things are equalized? Are white corporations not? I mean, these issues were addressed by other people, but those people are not being invoked now. How does the political system function? Can the political system function unless you adjust the economy? There's just some basic questions that are not being kind of like fundamentally pushed right now, and that becomes an issue. The targeting comment that Trevor made is very important, right? Who is targeted and what people are asking for is extremely important. And I think it's highly problematic when Americans are like more than supportive. I'm like, maybe I just been in this a bit too long, but I'm just like, if a bunch of people are just saying, yes, we're for it, I'm kind of like, well, maybe we didn't ask for enough or maybe we didn't ask for anything because basically folks are supportive of it. So this is Ambedkar. And the reason I'm a Ambedkar fan is precisely because of this. Gandhi was all about the transformation of somebody's heart or mind. I want some institutions to investigate, prosecute, and redistribute. And so in line with that, I don't see that being asked for. I don't see this kind of invocation of all aspects of America. I'm just like, Pigford versus Glickman. If anyone's heard of the case, this is one of the largest lawsuits that the United States government ever paid out, $1 billion, to the devastation done to all Black farmers. There was a huge lawsuit that was done, but USDA did their own investigation of exactly how USDA invested or did not invest in the Black community and forced out basically 90% of all Black farmers. We need that throughout all aspects of America in order to actually figure out what's going on. And so if in this wave and openness of public opinion, maybe if this is what happens, then it's fine. In this openness of public opinion to this particular like topic area, regardless of, they're not exactly clear on how it's going to be done. But if we have things like what USDA did across all aspects of America, then that's fine. But I don't see that being asked for because that implies some understanding of how the economy functions, how the political system functions, and how they're intricately connected with one another. And I don't think we're at that point yet. But I don't like being the person that's like, the older brother that's dissing a bunch of young people out there trying to talk about what's going on. But frankly, I'm like, I'm not feeling them. And so, but they're like, Kendrick Lamar, anybody over 35 can't tell me anything. And so this is built in systematically to impede their efforts to actually achieve the end that they think that they could actually achieve. And so from my perspective, it's very frustrating, which feels horrible because I'm so happy to see so many people mobilized. I think they're just not mobilized around the right thing, and there's no venue for having that conversation yet.
Can I just make a quick point?
Really quick, because you have so many people that want to ask you questions.
Yeah, I really agree with what Christian said, and it feels odd. The members, people on here, will see how odd it is for me to be sounding like the Trotskyist on the call, because it's really very striking to me. I agree with Eric about the importance of sport. And I would have agreed with that if we were talking about NASCAR. But actually, I don't think it will lose the NFL a single viewer, actually. I think the NFL did their work, and the reason that they've changed is that they know that the fans had changed. That's the way it works. That's the way that they all do it.
I'm going to come back to the two of you to get you each to write a few paragraphs on the NFL decision, and we will publish that on our microsite, I hope. But I'm going to take a list of questions. We only have until 3:15 because I think we lose Erica at that moment. So if you can be very succinct with your questions, but we do want to hear what people have to say. Peter, Tanguy, Serge, Trisha, and Anna Maria. So that tells you how succinct you have to be. The panelists aren't going to be able to answer all the questions. Please pick and choose. But Peter, if you unmute and you go first.
Thank you. I'm a member of Chatham House, and I come from a rather sort of interested but not involved scenario. And my question is, it needs to be tackled, that is racism, at a variety of levels. And one is, children are not inherently racist. And what's happening in the schools in America and the UK regarding teaching and examples of encompassing everybody as an equal sort of person. Thank you.
And Tangi, if you unmute.
Yes, Tangi Morgan. I am a member of Chatham House St. James's Round Table. And my question is actually, or maybe it's a statement or comment to both Christian and Erica around this term, defund the police. I think that it has been a very interesting and divisive, if you will, tag, if you will, because it's really not, as I understand it, about defunding. I mean, there needs to be a police force at some point, but I think it's really around, redirecting funds in various cities. And I think that actually kind of illustrates perhaps some of the maybe not deeply thought of terminology and how you position various demands, if you will. And I just thought, did you have any thoughts or comments around that? And then secondly, to Trevor, being a African-American that is, has been in the UK for almost better part of 18, 20 years, I find it interesting when you comment around companies here that are very interested and open in the statements recently around hashtag Black Lives Matter and standing in solidarity, how they are actually open to, diverse people coming onto their boards and to having more senior representation within their group. So I find that also very interesting. Thank you.
Serge.
My name is Serge Rama. I'm a French national, originally from the French Caribbean, and an enthusiast of Chatham House. My question is partly to what Christian alluded to, i.e. the success that the case brought against USDA had in terms of addressing some of the ills that the Black farmers suffered. So my question is, where is the Supreme Court in all this, or where are the legislative efforts to try and address some of the structural issues of racism by changing laws, getting some laws struck out?
Thank you very, very much. This is really, truly fantastic. I just wanted to say two quick points. One is on schooling. Someone just mentioned, what's happening at education levels. One of the best education that my kids got, and this wasn't a privileged education, although it wasn't a privileged environment, was in Washington, D.C. They both went to the French lycée from the age of 3, and they were very much the minority there, because there is a huge amount of Africans who come to the States, not as ambassador level, but they work in the diplomatic corps, but at very lowly levels. And this school is heavily subsidized by the French government, so it's not expensive to go. And there, I would say make that into every child's education, at least for the first 5 years of their life, and they just do not understand what you talk about prejudice, because everything is so nuanced. Everybody's such a mix. Everyone is all kinds of things. So that's just one thing, which actually put my kids, and I wasn't even aware of it, onto a level of understanding and relating to the world, which looks like is very unusual. We still think of it as usual in our family. Now, my daughter today has a startup in New York, which is for creatives and freelancers, but solely through the Black and Brown community, the LGBT community, and women. And and her boyfriend, who's African-American from the Bronx, went on a full scholarship because he comes from a very lowly background, full scholarship to NYU. And the racism that he has experienced in his life in New York from the Bronx is really to be frank, shocking. I mean, it really is shocking the way he was taken away in manacles, going to school, all kinds of things, which was under that sort of Bloomberg era. But what's interesting is to watch their startup now and what the discussions are and what they're doing. And there is something to, I know it's very trite and trivial, there's definitely a different type of tone coming through on Twitter in terms of, if you want to call it the black and white community. There is a real sense of coming together, not, oh, stop doing us a favor, you know, we don't understand each other. There is this solidarity there that I haven't seen before. And secondly, also that I wanted to ask you guys, how do you feel about the effectiveness of the cancel community, cancel culture? I know it's glib. I know there's a lot of discussion in universities about what free speech means and how we should be thinking. But honestly, the effect that I have seen in the immediacy of how my daughter's startups community, because it's a membership community for people who will never be seen in the creative industries unless, you know, they can go through this pipeline. And then suddenly everyone's going, my God, these guys are so cool. There's one guy who's been doing the most incredible photographs based on sort of Michelangelo's Pietà with Jesus, but of African mothers with their boys, and the boys can be 5 or they can be 25, it doesn't matter, but it's in that position. Suddenly everybody wants to know this guy. But while he accepted all these incredible assignments and he's at GQ and National Geographic wants to do something, he has made a public statement about what are they genuinely trying to do? Is this tokenism, or are they changing their entire way of doing their business model, right? But so what I wanted to ask you after all this is, on the cancel culture, it is incredible how people have had to step down. This new generation, if you like, whether it's millennials, but also obviously Gen Z, all it takes is a whiff of that double standard, and those people are out right now. So can we use that effectively? I know you guys are amazing because you've got the analytics, you're thinking about this really in a very, very sustainable, serious way. But is it being effective? Are we pushing something that's been really too slow and too much double standards? Are we pushing it faster in a good way? Sorry I took so long, but thank you.
I think, you know, it's really good and people are very passionate. I'm really sorry, Erica, because we're running right up against your time. Anna Maria, if you have I know you've been waiting. So if you put your question, we'll come back to the speakers and you can choose those things that you'd like to respond to. So I would encourage you to be selective. Sophie Grier, if you'd like to unmute and ask your question.
I actually put my question in the chat box, which was about first of all the Black Panther made me think about the influence of Africa in the 60s and the independence movement, and whether there's any kind of two-way influence now between Black Lives Matter and various movements in Africa, which is harder to do now, I think, than it was in the 60s, because we just don't know what's going on. The news here is just all Trump. The other question is about raising the stakes. What should the issues be? And I feel like just raising the slogan of defund the billionaires would be a really good start. Defund the billionaires. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you. I think my closing rule is always those who've come from furthest go last. So I think that means Trevor in London, Erica in Cambridge, Mass, and then Christian in Michigan, because you're furthest away. So over to you, Trevor.
I think you said Erica had to go, so I'm happy to go after her.
Oh, right, yeah. No, she's saying you go. Off you go.
Okay, in that case, I'll be as brisk as I can. On the schools question, I think we need to be, in this general thing, I think we need to be a little bit careful not to interpret our own experiences as general. The truth of the matter is that, and I'm sorry, I'm going to go into geek mode here, New York schools are more segregated today than they were at the time of Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. And there's a whole series of reasons why that's happening. Some of it is economic, some of it is for cultural, but actually, I think we ought not to imagine that things are going in one direction. Here, something similar actually is happening. We did some work on this 3 years ago, and I can't remember the exact numbers, but I think what is almost certainly true is that more than half of the minority children in England started school in classes where more than half of the children were themselves minority. We are not heading in the direction of integration. On the issue, the question I was asked about companies, look, the position is at the moment, on the FTSE 100, 1/3 of the boards do not have a single person of color on them. And these are global companies operating all over the world. If you look at the top 3 positions in, the board membership of the FTSE 100, that's about 1,100 people, of whom I think 11 are black. And that is companies from right across, including American companies like Carnival, whose CEO, Arnold Donald, is black. So we are not moving very far, to be honest. And I would myself think that is the kind of place where I would want to focus, because in the end, that's where decisions get made. That's where all the stuff that really matters happens. As one way in which to deal with that, and of course, again, I'll repeat, I would say this, wouldn't I? One of the things that I think we are not really addressing, and I find this very frustrating, a lot of the slogans, and like Christian, I'm quite exhilarated by the idea of young people being active. But I think people got to focus on something that actually matters and is contemporary. And one of the things I find kind of disappointing is to hear people chanting the same slogans I did when I was 22, which is a really, really long time ago. I would love to see somebody dealing with what is actually the principal contemporary cause of chronic racial disadvantage, and that is automatic decision-making and artificial intelligence on houses, on admissions, on recruitment, on mortgage finance, motorist premium, you name it. Every single big decision that affects the average person has an automatic decision-making or an AI component, and we know that every single one of those processes is racially biased. Yet I'm not hearing that. Most of the disadvantage that takes place in developed countries right now stems from that source, not from the fact that somebody doesn't like me because I'm black. And if I'm completely honest, I don't give a shit that they don't like me because I'm black. What I don't want is for the process by which I get access to goods or services or position to be biased automatically against me. And if I had a real sort of thing that I think people should urgently be getting onto, it would be that, because that's where the action is now.
Thank you, Trevor. Erica.
Yeah, thanks. So I just wanted to go back to one of the issues that came up earlier about what is the movement about and, you know, who is it representing? And I think it's pretty clear that this movement is a Black-led movement that is about anti-Blackness and anti-Black racism explicitly in the United States, and that has global reverberations because it has global resonance. And the claims that are being made, you know, Tanji brought up the issue of defund the police and whether that's divisive or not. I think a useful thing to think about is that, you know, the abolition of slavery in the United States was incredibly unpopular and divisive. We fought a civil war over it. The end of legal segregation, when mass protests were happening demanding the end of legalized segregation in the United States after Brown versus Board, and then during the Montgomery bus boycotts and during the Nashville lunch counter sit-ins that spread across the country. These were divisive, unpopular, and public opinion didn't shift until after the policies were eradicated. You know, I think defunding the police and ending mass incarceration and upending the carceral system in general is a claim that that challenges power, and because of that is always going to have divided responses. But I think that you know, the movement, I can't speak for them obviously, but my sense from watching the discourse play out is that defund the police is what is meant. by that claim. And local movements and local chapters interpret that in a way that makes sense to them. And that self-determination and the ability of Black-led organizations and Black-led movements to define the terms of their liberation is the main principle that's being promoted through that. And so I think, you know, to some extent, you know, I think that it is, as somebody alluded to earlier, the question is whether attitudes need to change before policies change. And one of the main points that Ibram Kendi makes in his recent writings is that, you know, the ideas always have followed the policies. The racist policies were put in place first, and racism as an idea followed to rationalize and justify those policies. And so what Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black Lives is asking for is nothing short of a fundamental shift in our power relationships with regard to racism, structural racism, institutionalized racism, in a way that then will allow for a true reckoning to take place in this country around its original sin. So that's what I think is going on, but I'm maybe speaking out of turn.
Okay, there's a lot. So yes, children are not inherently racist. I think there's some interesting stuff that's being done, but it depends upon which models you're drawing upon. So Bill Ayers, for example, has got a book called Teach to Freedom, which I think is fascinating. Bill Ayers, unfortunately, was connected with the Weathermen, and so his particular pedagogical models aren't necessarily being used all throughout the location. Defund the police, I think, is interesting. I think reprioritize would have been like, we know from the social movement literature that single focus movements generally tend to do better. And so this kind of like follows from that marketing. I wish to question the premise though, do we need the police? I think Jim Scott's argument is very clear. We've been on the planet as humans for quite some time. We were here before states. And after that, it took a while before police were created. So I don't even know if we need them. I'm one who doesn't necessarily, I don't favor centralized coercive capabilities anyway. So, but it seems like human history goes with my particular orientation in Jim. The success of Pickford versus Glickman, the Supreme Court, no court really had anything to do with it. USDA did this of their own accord. And so it turns out that different agencies run these types of evaluations all the time. Whether or not anything happens with it, however, is something different. And so it has something to do with, this was under an administration that kind of like was ready to push it. Cancel culture and its importance. A friend of mine, Errol Henderson, has a book, The Revolution Will Not Be Theorized, that talks about culturally led movements and how that could lead to political or economic change. I want ownership changes. I want Google to give stock to schools. I want to hear about how some fundamental changes will happen to certain things in terms of the economy. Because frankly, okay, first off, being from New York, I have a particular attitude towards interactions with other individuals. I don't really care what anyone thinks about me. I don't care about public opinion. What I want is, I want resources, I want opportunity, I want people to get out of my way, because that's basically what it's come down to. So if someone happens to like me as well, then fine. But if they don't, then just do these other things, and I think we're good. As to the African connection, this is a bizarre and controversial point, but many, including Errol's book, there's a certain kind of African-American denialist position where, like in a Fanon-like sense, we have some self-hatred, so we look to Africans to give us some solutions. This is part of the problem with the 1960s and 70s. We were looking for an anti-colonial strategy to be used in the context of the United States, one of the most powerful countries on the planet, where they had a very serious interest with regards to how we were going to be treated. And so it's a misapplication of the model. But as his book identifies, if African Americans were looking to Du Bois and Locke and drawing upon the models that existed indigenously, then they actually would have a better chance of kind of like getting the things that they were trying to pursue. And so I think there's, I'm glad that there's movements abroad that are mirroring stuff that's going in the States, and using that as a prism from which to kind of like talk about exactly what their situation is. But we need to be careful about like misapplying models, right? So it's good that we're identifying, hey, we're being persecuted by the police too. It's like, okay, so what is your police structure set up to do? I mean, we need to have these kind of like follow-up, I think, that are very important as well.
So that was tremendous. We have a lot, I think we have some, I don't know, friendliness across the panel. I don't know if you knew each other before. I have a feeling you didn't. But it is interesting, the meeting of the minds. It's fascinating to watch. The questions are extraordinary. The last thing that you need is a non-expert outside the community to sum up. So I'm not going to do that. But I will tell you that we have recorded this. It will be posted, in addition to the fact that we have gotten through a litany of issues and debates, whether it's on structure and ideas, what comes first. I love the comment about AI. And the comment about, I don't care what people think, change the access and the structure issues. But I also like the optimism. But we also, on this call, we've had so many citations to court cases, to books, to scholars, to activists, to literature, that I think it is actually worth going back through and pulling those out and putting together, what to read over the course of the summer kind of list for those of us who want to school up. Thank you so much to Trevor, to Erica, to Christian. It really, and to all of you who ask questions, it makes a world of difference. If you unmute all of you who are here still, and join me in thanking our panelists and encouraging you please to come back and speak at Chatham House again, because this is a topic that is not going away, nor should it. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Leslie.
Thank you very much.
And thank you to the panelists. They were great. I learned a lot.